Hello and welcome back to our first episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa for 2021. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, and I am joined by my co-host, Andrew de Block, and we are streaming to you live from BirdLife South Africa's head offices in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yeah, so hearty welcome from my side as well to all of our viewers tonight on Zoom and Facebook Live, as we pick up from where we left off last year with a tantalizing schedule of fantastic speakers in 2021. If you'd like to communicate with us this evening, please use the Zoom chat room, and remember to select all panelists and attendees if you want everyone listening to see your message. Please also ask your questions to the speaker by using the Q&A box throughout the webinar. If you're watching us on Facebook Live tonight, you can use the comment feed as well for your comments and questions, and we'll follow up on those. Our speaker will answer all the questions at the end of her presentation tonight.
We love hearing from all of you, so let us know you are tuning in on all major social media channels by using the hashtag Conservation Conversations. 2020 was a super year for the Conservation Conversations webinar series, and if you missed out on any of our previous episodes, you can catch up with the recordings on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel or listen to them via our podcast, available on all major streaming services. We'd like to encourage all of you listening to please visit our YouTube channel and click the subscribe button to help us grow support for this webinar content and to widen our audience. Thank you to those of you who continue to generously donate towards our webinars using the Cricket Donations platform. All you have to do is simply scan that QR code or visit the Conservation Conversations webpage to find the link to our donations portal. Your contributions are helping us to keep these talks free for all to learn and enjoy.
So tonight is all about our Bird of the Year, and that's why we're all here. So for those of you who've been anxiously waiting to hear about the merchandise, I have good and bad news for you. The good news is that we have lots of exciting 2021 Bird of the Year merchandise in store this year, including pin badges, fluffies, t-shirts, and we're also embracing the new normal by producing limited branded face masks as well. The unfortunate news is that Shop for the Birds at Isdale House is currently closed due to the coronavirus situation, but we will be moving operations online very soon, and you will be able to order your Cape Rockjumper Bird of the Year gear in the not too distant future. Please also keep an eye out for our Bird of the Year educational resources, which will be available freely on our website and will include lesson plans, informative posters, educational tools, and more. And please do share our Bird of the Year social media posts, which will be highlighting this very special species and some of the prominent threats that it faces.
Given the current state of the coronavirus in South Africa and abroad, BirdLife South Africa has taken the decision to move the 5th Learn About Birds or LAB conference onto a virtual platform. LAB will run on 27 and 28 May, and this will be run through the Zoom platform. There will be a dedicated science lab taking place from 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon on each day. And this will be followed by 2 layman's lectures in the evenings at 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock. You can either register for both the science and the layman's lab, or if you're enjoying this kind of webinar format, you can also then sign up for just the layman's lab lectures. You can register to attend all of these through our website, and the link to register and pay for your tickets to Lab 2021 are available through BirdLife South Africa's website. So please hop on over and look for the lab tab, or you can email lab2021@birdlife.org.za for more information.
BirdLife South Africa is also excited to announce that bookings for the Skukuza Citizen Scientist Bird Surveys are now open. This event is a first of its kind undertaking, co-hosted by the Skukuza Science Leadership Initiative, and combines daily bird surveys on foot and from vehicles in the south of Kruger National Park, led by specialist guides, an opportunity to engage with Kruger's top scientific minds in intimate fireside lectures, contributions to science and conservation within the park, as well as sponsoring a mentoring opportunity for up-and-coming bird guides and young scientists in the local community. The event takes place from the 21st to the 27th of February and is inclusive of all board and lodging, guiding fees and lectures, and it's worth noting that non-birding family are also welcome to attend. And we also can supply child minding services if this is arranged in advance. If you're interested in this event, please email me at andrew.deblock@birdlife.org.za. My email is on screen right now, and I'll make sure that you have all the relevant information. The first deposit is unfortunately due in 2 days' time on the 21st of January, 30 days ahead of the event. So please don't dally in checking and inquiring about this event. You really don't want to miss out.
Now, lastly, we are sure that many of you enjoyed successful birding trips over the festive season. This is a reminder to join the South Africa Listers Club, a profoundly South African community of birders that have seen 300 or more species in our diverse country. Joining is as simple as typing your name, hometown, and total into the form on the South African Listers Club webpage on screen now, which can be accessed via the Go Birding tab on our website. If you are already a member, remember to update your total regularly via that same link.
And on to the main course for tonight. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Krista Oswald to the first Conservation Conversations webinar for 2021. Krista holds a BSc from Dalhousie in Canada, an MSc from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, and a PhD from Rhodes University. Both Krista's MSc and PhD were centered on the Cape Rockjumper, making her an excellent candidate to showcase this year's Bird of the Year. Krista has traveled back to North America to prepare for her upcoming postdoctoral work starting in April this year. But when she's not traveling and enjoying photographic opportunities, she's home with her cats, Lieutenant Nyota Uhura and Hyperion. We'll have to ask you some questions about those names in the Q&A box, and also knitting sweaters. So some of you might think that sweater knitting is a bit of an arbitrary pastime to bring up, but Krista's tuning in tonight from the rural Canadian countryside, where warm clothing is all but essential, but bandwidth is also at a premium. So if there are any slight audiovisual glitches tonight, please just do bear with us. It will be worth it for the awesome presentation that we anticipate. So we look forward to this very interesting and entertaining evening. Krista, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I will be turning off my video to try to make this a little bit better, but I really wanted to thank BirdLife South Africa for asking me to do this. There's not a lot I like more than sharing stories about the work I did on rock jumpers. Yeah, so just as a very brief background, I was pretty late to get involved in the birding community. I actually sort of only discovered birding as a thing in late 2014 when I did my honors on tree swallows. After I finished that, I knew I wanted to do postgraduate school, and I knew I wanted to do it abroad as well. And so one of the places that came up was South Africa. I was sent a pretty amazing sounding opportunity that would be working on the physiology of Cape Rockjumpers. However, being as new to birding as I was, I actually thought I might be working on penguins at first. However, when I did a little bit more research and note the Cape Rockjumper was a mountain bird, I was even more excited because mountains are probably my favorite landscape. So I packed up everything that I thought I would need for the foreseeable future and flew to Port Elizabeth, where I met my supervisor, Ben Smith, and we spent a fairly frantic week organizing everything I need to go into the field, including purchasing a car, which through a series of unfortunate red tape and visa events, I actually never ended up owning in the 5 years that I was in South Africa. But after driving what was technically Ben's car out to Blue Hill Nature Reserve, I prepared to spend the next few years studying rock jumpers. Blue Hill was where most of my research took place, and I ended up living there for roughly what constituted 2 of the 5 years that I was in South Africa. Now, it was always one of my favorite places to be. In 2018, I loved it even more because after the wildfires, we actually had jumpers coming right up close to the farm, which was pretty incredible. So my initial master's on physiology led pretty much directly into a PhD, part of which was looking at rock jumper population genetics and basically just trying to see whether or not they were interbreeding between the different mountain ranges. Rock jumpers, since they don't fly in sort of the normal sense of the term, we just weren't sure whether or not they were managing to get from one mountain range to another. There still are no records of rock jumpers being seen anywhere in the little Karoo, so I'm still curious how they disperse and when they disperse from one range to another. But in order to do genetics, we needed to collect DNA. And of course, to get DNA, you have to be able to catch birds. The way that I prefer and ended up being the best method for catching rockjumpers was using baited snap traps. These are one of my favorite things because they really let you target a specific species, and they have very sort of minimal effects on the bird itself. As you can see, even once they're caught, they're sort of left in a nice loose netting, so there's very, very little injury. We never had an injury in the entire time that I was catching rockjumpers, which is obviously preferable. That we went from catching one bird every 2 days to catching 2 or 3 birds a day by the end of my collecting phase. Now, we did get a little bit of bycatch, but really not too much when it comes to the grand scheme of things. By far, the most bycatch were rock thrushes, both the Cape and Sentinel, but we did catch a number of familiar chats as well as rockagamas and anything that sort of just couldn't say no to a free tasty worm. I had really, really hoped that just by chance at some point we would catch a ground woodpecker, but as an anteating bird, they were just not interested in the worms at all. And unfortunately, I only had a license to ring rockjumpers, so everything else got a free meal and got to escape without any sort of metal ID band. Now, the Cedar Bird was the first trip that I went on to catch rockjumpers, and I did this in partnership with Campbell Fleming, who was collecting sugarbird and orange-breasted sunbird DNA. So we decided to partner up and went on a trip paid for by the FITS and actually BirdLife South Africa, and started in the Cedar Bird. This is where my morals tend to not really like habituating anything, but I have to say I was pretty happy with how habituated the rockjumpers were at the Wolfberg Arch. I have never seen this before and probably never will again, but I remember walking along a little path and turning around to see a rockjumper following Campbell and us sort of freezing, unsure what to do. And then I shouted at Campbell to set a trap as soon as possible. And you can see this little male rockjumper was just waiting while Campbell was putting a worm in the trap. However, our next stop was Anysberg, and this was definitely a mountain that I both loved but hated because it defeated me in my sample sizes. So the first time that I went there with Campbell, we were lucky enough to have pretty much the whole reserve come up with us. The reserve manager, Marius, took our trip up the mountain as an excuse to come up along with us with a few of the other rangers to do a biodiversity survey on the top of the mountain. So Campbell and I camped on the top of the eastern edge of Anysberg for 5 nights, but we had the Anysberg crew spend the first night there with us before they left and then came to pick us up 4 days later. The first day was actually pretty great. I mean, you wake up to rockjumper call, which is an experience that I don't think can really be matched. But it came to the second day and we ended up waking up to frost and a bit of snow, and it was absolutely freezing. And it's very hard to catch rockjumpers when the worms won't move. You actually have a very limited temperature range where the worms will be active enough to make the rockjumpers want to go for them. So we only ended up catching 3 rockjumpers on the first trip that I took to Anysberg, and we did have a bit more success with the sugarbirds, so that was great for Campbell. And then on the way out of the reserve, we actually had a really neat sighting of Karoo aromamelas a bit out of range. So 6 months later, I returned with a new field assistant, Cameron, who had actually flown from California to spend 3 weeks with me in the mountains. And this time I made sure I had all of the gear that I could possibly need to stay warm in case that happened again, even though it was March and it shouldn't get cold. You just never know when you're in the mountains. So we chose a slightly different location that had a really nice big cave that we set up our camp inside of, thinking that would protect us from the elements. Now, we managed to catch 2 birds again on the first 2 days, and then the mountaintop actually completely engulfed in cloud and mist rain for the next 3 days that we were up there. And again, we sort of just had to huddle in our tent because we'd been dropped off on the top of the mountain again by Marius, who was going to come pick us up 5 days later. So we huddled in our tents for most of the day and just hoped for a clear morning, but didn't really get one until the very last day. We also found out that caves, as lovely as they are for shade in the hot sun, are not actually waterproof. And even once it cleared up, it was still raining inside the cave from leaking while it was perfectly dry outside. So that was a bit ironic. However, this was probably the most from the entrance of the cave while we were sitting and having our coffee. So that was a pretty incredible experience. Now, the West Sportberg Mountains, this was a really fun place to go. We actually ended up camping on private land where we were driven up by the farmer who offered to lend me his shotgun because he thought we were going to be, you know, just kind of helpless up there on the mountain. But I did decline, decided that, you know, we really have to worry about our baboons, and I've never had any sort of issue with them. But we did end up having to camp, I would say, about 5 kilometers from the nearest rock jumpers. And we weren't actually sure where we would start to find the rock jumpers, but I've often found that ground woodpeckers can be a pretty good indication that you're heading into an area that might have rock jumpers. So we did manage to find a good amount there and had a lovely natural water source, which always makes camping so much more enjoyable. The East Sportberg was a little bit of an interesting situation because the first time I'd gone there, it was green and lush, but we got hailed off the mountain. So I had to come back a few months later with a different field assistant. Gabe Foley from Canada actually joined me, and he managed to get his 400 species as the rock jumper, which was pretty special. But this was interesting because a lot of people sort of tried to warn me that there might not be rock jumpers there because it had burned probably 2 months before we got there, somewhere between 2 and 3 months. And as you can see, it was completely denuded of any sort of green vegetation. However, rock jumpers don't seem to actually move when there's fire from what we can tell. I'm not sure what they do. Maybe they wait on top of a large boulder and just watch the fire go by, but you can pretty much always find rock jumpers in their territories, whether or not there's been a recent fire. Now, setting up a field station in the mountains is obviously a bit tricky sometimes. So you have to have everything with you in a day pack that you need. And the good part of this, though, is that it lets us process the bird within their territory so that we don't have to take them far away, which means we can really quickly right back where we caught them. So basically what we do is find like a nice shady spot, maybe slightly covered so that we didn't disturb the other birds in the territory. And when we catch a bird, you immediately run, grab them, put them in a bag, do your quick processing where we take a few measurements and a small blood sample, and then release them right back into their territory, usually within 5 minutes. We did get to take as well a brief trip to catch a few Drakensberg rock jumpers, which we needed for our DNA comparison. My supervisor, Ben, and his family actually joined us on this trip, which ended up being surprisingly necessary because my car refused to start in the cold mornings. Much like the rock jumpers, it wanted to sit and wait until it was nice and sunny and warm before it started moving. So we ended up having to drive around up Noday's Neck Pass and over to Tiffindale. Now, catching Drakensberg rock jumpers is actually really easy compared to Cape Rockjumpers for some reason. Probably because they just have larger groups and they're not maybe as used to, or maybe they're more used to humans. We weren't really sure, but they definitely seem to be much easier. And I remember, I think we caught birds in one day, which was by far a record. It can also be downright luxurious because where we were, there was the lodge and the ski resort, which let us catch birds on their properties. So this meant having a nice coffee and a biscuit at 10 ahead while we were catching, and then heading over to Tiffindale where we were catching birds on the ski slope and then processing them just on the picnic tables. It also meant that even when we weren't at Tennahead or Tippendale, we were catching them alongside the road, which is always just really nice to have everything that you could need in a car. Generally had everything I needed in a bag. It meant that not only could you have a nice flat surface with something like a cooler box, but you could also make coffee and have snacks while you were catching, which made it much more enjoyable. However, the Drakensberg to me doesn't quite have that same angry look of a Cape Rockjumper, which I just came to find the most endearing. And surprisingly, they are actually extremely gentle in the hand. They never tried to bite. They maybe tried to kick just a little bit, but they're very, very calm in the hand. And so there's very little, so that it actually helps take very little time to give them a ring and measure them before you can let them go. Now we're just going to have a little bit of a gratuitous fynbos scenery. So no matter how frustrating the day may be, there's always a nice view is pretty much the mantra of studying rock jumpers. You are always in the most scenic and beautiful areas that I think I've ever seen. So this is Plain Riviere. This was a privately owned reserve in the Winterhoek Mountains in the Eastern Cape, just down the same range from Coxcomb, if you're familiar with that. This mountain was very interesting because they have a lodge up in the mountains that in theory should be right in rock jumper sort of habitat, but I went up there with a friend and for the first day we didn't see or hear a single rock jumper, and I was fairly convinced that they actually weren't there, possibly because the growth was very dense. So my friend Sophie and I stayed at the mountain lodge. We got a really good deal because they'd shut down from the drought, so they actually weren't operating, which meant that we were basically camping, but inside the lodge. Now this mountain lodge is extremely beautiful, as you can see. And so when we'd had such an unsuccessful afternoon and next morning, we came back to the lodge to make lunch and sort of just enjoy relaxing in the sun for the day, changed out of our gear, had what kind of a shower that we could, and we're preparing lunch when I heard the call of a rock jumper out the window, and I started freaking out because I knew they were there and we'd been looking, we hadn't found them. And so I, in completely not field gear, threw on my gaiters and my hiking boots and ran out with, I think, 4 traps and managed to catch a male and female, actually just right down from the plunge pool. So rock jumpers are very, very sneaky, and you can be completely convinced that they're not in an area and then have them just been there the entire time, possibly just laughing at you as you try to find them. However, 2 years later, I think, I tried to come back here with Ben, as well as a visiting professor, Mark. And that time, I'm 100% sure there weren't any rock jumpers. We spent 3 days at the lodge and didn't hear or see rock jumpers, but strangely, we see mocking cliff chats, which was very interesting and possibly out of range for them as well. So there's a bit of a questionable hypothesis on whether or not the mocking cliff chats excluded the rock jumpers from the area, or if it just became too sort of overgrown for rock jumpers and they left of their own accord. Now, the Swartberg Mountains, the Swartberg Pass is actually my personal favorite place to see the rock jumpers as well as the other endemics. I just really, really like it, especially as a drive. And this was the road to Die Hel that a few months as well after the burns, so everything kind of had this orange sepia kind of feel to it. On this trip, I was joined again by Cameron, who had, I think, the absolute worst and best combo of any field assistants I had. In the 3 weeks that she joined me, we started out west in the Longa, where we drove up to rock jumper territories only to find a wildfire. So we literally were driven off the mountain by fire, and then decided to head early to Anysberg, where a shut down game reserve meant we had to take a 6-hour detour. And then I got a puncture in my tire heading into the nature reserve. And then that was where we got dropped off on the top of the mountain for the 5 nights, where we were in rain for most of it before we went to the Swartberg. I went for help with a nice farmer family that stopped along the road. However, she also However, Cameron also got the best of it because during that same fire, the reserve had rescued a small caracal kitten. And so I don't think anything could have ruined any part of the trip once she got to sort of play with this little kitten. And she actually ended up coming back the next year to help me with reproduction. Now, Kamanasi needs a little bit of a shout out because it is probably one of the more dramatic mountain ranges as far as just the steep slopes and valleys. It is closed to the public completely, but we did manage to get dispensation from the manager to let us drive up there and camp for a couple nights as well and get a few samples. And of course, Sir Lowry's Pass, which pretty much everybody will be familiar with as one of the two easier places to see rock jumpers, with, of course, Royals trump them by far. I actually managed to, I think, ring 9 birds at Royals in 2 or 3 days, maybe, of trying. But I just personally loved seeing Sir Lowry's Pass after the burn, because these formations always sort of remind me of the ancient ruins of some civilization. Now, while you're looking for rock jumpers and spending that much time in the fynbos Mountains, I'm to see the rest of the endemics on quite a regular basis. That being said, specifically the canary and the siskin, I only managed to get decent photos of, I think, in my last year in South Africa. They were quite good at evading me when it came to taking photos. And I think both of these photos were taken the same day at a little water feature that they'd had to come down in to drink during a drought. The Hottentot button quail, I did manage to see and get some terrible photos of when I was helping Alan do his button quail flush surveys throughout the fynbos. I think this photo is absolutely incredible that Henny managed to take in the Bavians Cliff. And the only one, though, that you don't see while you're catching rock jumpers is the Agulhas long-billed lark. That one you do have to drive a little bit out of your way to get into the proper sort of farmland and rhinosterfell that they enjoy. But I just wanted to sort of try to start to wrap up with a little bit of a more cute storyline as far as talking about reproduction, which was my favorite data to collect. I absolutely adored finding the nests and watching them raise their young. So this all took place at Blue Hill, and most of it was from 2017 and 2018, though there were a few nests we found randomly in 2015 and 16. And my main aim here had been to film the nests to look at how parents provisioned and spent time in the nest correlated with temperature. So here you can see we had a predator camera set up on a nest. We put these at all of the predation. And then on the far right, you can see what's probably a 6-day-old nestling. And then in the middle, that is a fledgling that's probably about 3 months out of the nest. So at Blue Hill, in addition to the normal saffron metal band, we also give the rock jumpers their color combinations. This helped with my behavior study as well, but for reproduction especially, we wanted to know sort of who was nesting with who, how many nest attempts they had, and just really keep track of all of those little minutiae. As well, we gave any nestlings of 15 days or older color rings once we had finished all of our filming and everything the last time that we saw them before they would fledge. So on day 15 or 16, they got color rings, and then we wouldn't go back to that territory until a few days after they should have fledged. We found what I personally still think is an extraordinary amount of nests. Initially, I'd hoped for about 20, 25. 2017, we found 19, which I think all of us were just over the moon overjoyed with how many we'd actually managed to find. But we blew that out of the water in 2018, finding an additional 40 nests. They can come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes when it comes right down to it. Some are really neat, like the one on the top right. Some are a bit more of like a messy bowl. And then my personal favorite was on the bottom left, which I called my Frank Lloyd Wright nest because it was rock that somehow they had made their nest inside of. It took me a while to find that one because I have never seen that sort of nest built before. We also found some 3-egg nests in 2018, 15 actually, which was incredible because if you look at any of the literature, it pretty much all says without fail Cape Rockjumpers lay 2-egg nests. So even though I think Alan had found a 3-egg nest once, it was only one and we thought it was just a rarity. And then the first one that I found in 2018, I again thought it might just be that female. But as the season went on, we ended up finding 15 nests that had 3 eggs from 7 different territories. So it's obviously a bit more complicated than that, and possibly has to do with the fact that we had so much failure the year before and they were trying to make up for it, or maybe even just really good weather conditions. I know that after a few years of drought, Blue Hill finally had sort of average rainfall again in 2018. So maybe birds were just taking advantage of the situation. However, once you start looking for rockjumper nests, you pretty much start finding nests of everything. So even though I was sitting in rockjumper territories trying to find their nest, you sort of out of the corner of your eye catch a different species of bird acting suspicious. And I ended up finding nests from, I think, something like 13 different species during 2018 at Blue Hill. These are just a few of them. So they were it was always really fun. There's nothing quite as cute as finding a nest, and I'd sort of take 1 or 2 photos to upload to eBird and just to have on record in case they were useful for science at some point, and then keep my distance after that and just monitor it through binoculars. Now the end goal of finding the nest, of course, was to film. So in 2016, the Tigerberg Bird Club had given me some funds to buy some video cameras. So we decided to test these out at the nest that I found earlier that year. And this is just a little video that I made of condensed snippets of footage from the first nest. So you can hear them making those cute little contact calls. And this is, I think, a 1-day-old nestling in the nest. Like this nestling has just hatched maybe the day before or even that morning. And other than egg laying, rockjumpers, the male and female, do share in all of the parental duties. So you can see this male came to feed, but then he settled in for a little bout of brooding. But in 2018, I filmed quite a few different nests. So if you do want to see some of these videos, I made short little videos of rockjumpers feeding nestlings at all different ages. And I have put them up on YouTube to be linked to the Birds of the World website. So if you want to see those, I think they're adorable. And yeah, so those are online, and they also feed them a bunch of really interesting things. We have video footage not just of butterflies like here, but sometimes it'll be like lizards, chameleons, I guess that is the lizard, but lizard tails specifically, which is always really amusing. And of course, spiders and grasshoppers are a favorite, and sometimes just little worms, and they feed larger and larger prey items as the nestlings grow. But of course, all of this took a heck of a lot of time, energy, help, and funding. So this is just my shout out to all of the people that gave me help. Rockjumper research is impossible to do by yourself. I always needed at least one person helping me, and for reproduction, I think there were always at least 3 or 4 of us in a team so that you could try to maximize searching different territories and setting up cameras while checking on a different nest and all of that. And I did have amazing supervisors who I think, other than Shelly, all managed to join me at some point and have a little bit of fun trying to catch rockjumpers, as well as, like I said, lots of field assistants. Cameron Brock and Lizzie and John Diener both returned multiple times to help me, which was great because they already had some experience, as well as a bunch of other people that sort of came out when they were available, who were studying with me in South Africa. So again, really sorry about all of the internet issues. I hope that not too much of that was disjointed, and I'm so excited that everybody was able to join and hear a little bit about what it's like to study rock jumpers. So thank you very much.
Krista, thank you so much. That really was a fascinating tour of some of the incredible habitat that rock jumpers call home. Certainly parts of this country I've never seen before, so it was wonderful to hear all of your experiences about these wonderful birds of the year, and to see those really cool videos of them bringing little prey items into the nest is just wonderful. Andrew and I were saying when we were testing it out earlier, we weren't sure that video was going to play, but it played beautifully. So Andrew's put the link to Krista's YouTube channel in the chat feed, and I'd highly recommend everyone goes and has a look at some of her videos. They really are fascinating behavioral documentation of these wonderful birds. Andrew, you've got some other things to share with us before we open for questions?
Yes, just some housekeeping before we let Krista answer some of your burning questions. A reminder to everyone to please participate in the post-webinar survey. This will pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. We're hoping to collect some broad information on our audience, your demographics, or interests. So we'd appreciate you taking just 2 minutes to fill out the online survey for us. So I think you'll all agree that we've hit the ground running tonight, but there is more in store for you in 2021. Next week, we welcome Lo Kutzer of C&P Safaris to the Zoom room, who will be telling us about his philosophy of patience when it comes to birds, birders, and bird photography. And he'll share some of his inspiring photographs and stories from the magnificent Chobe River. So that's one you do not want to miss. And then after Lo, we have a webinar on wetland conservation, which is a big focus of BirdLife South Africa, followed by a look at 20 years of the Durban Harbour bird counts, presented by the inimitable David Allen of the Durban Natural History Museum, as well as Dr. Alistair McGuinness, BirdLife South Africa's Seabird Conservation Program Manager, who in a previous life or a previous career was an understudy to David. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. If you do have any questions, please do pop them in there for Krista. Melissa and I will go through them with her just now. And if you are on Facebook Live, please do pop your comments into the comment feed underneath that broadcast, and we will keep an eye on that as well. So Melissa, will you maybe kick us off with some questions?
Absolutely, Krista. I think the first one that we're going to ask you is, what was your favorite site that you got to go and sample these rock jumpers at?
Oh, that's a really good question. Honestly, maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment, but I would probably go back to Anysberg in a second. But that's also just because they usually could only drive us up on a Monday and come get us on a Friday, and then we would spend the weekend camping down at the visitor center, which is of course Little Karoo. So just as far as seeing like a huge difference in bird diversity, you get all of the Karoo things while you're down at the main office, and then you get the whole transition on the way up. So I mean, you see everything from Amur falcons and pale chanting goshawks to Burroughs eagles and rufous-breasted sparrowhawks once you're at the top. So yeah, that was pretty great.
Brilliant. I'm glad you enjoy the raptors too.
Yeah.
Melissa's not impartial at all. We have a question here from Janet Bloom. Janet would like to know, Krista, what you found of interest in the DNA samples that you mentioned, particularly, of course, with interest and respect to the Drakensberg rockjumper.
Yeah, that one's a bit interesting because, of course, there's no set percentage that species have to be different. So if you compare the percent difference of DNA between the Drakensberg and the Cape, it's not as great as it is between some other species, but it is a definitive line between Drakensberg as well as all of the Cape. So we don't really have a way to put it into perspective, but there is no evidence that they're interbreeding at this date and point. So even if they're not maybe that separate from each other genetically, I think at this point they're only going to become more separate because they're not able to get to one another. That being said, if anybody ever sees a rock jumper somewhere between the mountains, put it everywhere. I'm just so curious still. I think we should all make it a mission to be the first person to see a Cape Rockjumper somewhere in the Klein Karoo.
I'm sure there are some birders who will absolutely take you up on that challenge, Krista. Now, Speaking of finding these rock jumpers, Letitia Steinberg has asked what the best season is to look for rock jumpers.
You know, obviously I didn't actually do any sort of analysis of it, but my gut feeling is I thought it would be much easier to find them in the breeding season because they'd be calling more and more territorial. And in a way they are, but they do it around such a smaller area, usually around the nest, that you kind of have to luck into being in that place when it happens versus like anywhere else in their territory. They probably just don't care because as long as you don't come near the nest, they won't alarm call you. I would say I had the best luck catching birds in maybe March and April, probably because you have that year's young birds. And I think we all know that young birds tend to be a little bit dumber when it comes to being obvious and, you know, trying out calls and displays and all of that. So for me, there are more birds at that time of year because you still have all of the previous seasons, juveniles. Yeah, so I'd say March, April was when I had the best luck catching birds for sure, because they're more vocal, so they'd be easier to see. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember before I joined BirdLife South Africa, while I was doing my master's at the Fitzpatrick Institute, I was guiding part-time for a bird tour company. And I took some foreign guests, I think they were from the US, out to Royals to try and find Cape Rockjumpers and some fynbos endemics. And that day was the biggest tip I had ever received. And the only reason is because this baby rockjumper decided it was super curious about what was going on and actually literally came and danced around our feet. We didn't use playback, we didn't call it in. We just stayed very still while it was around us. And it was amazing the curiosity of these younger birds. I think it's something that people have experienced at Royals on an ongoing basis now, actually.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, that was a really cool experience, and one I won't forget. There's a question from Mark around the conservation status of Cape Rockjumpers. He says that he's looked it up and they're listed as near threatened, but he says you seem to have seen plenty of them. So he wants to know, is their conservation status improving or not?
No, I have seen plenty of them, but I did sort of purposefully go to their strongholds and like, you know, I didn't just like I'd have the hardest time seeing and finding them on the edges of ranges, sort of where they'd peter out. So Swartberg Pass is of course the highest point of the Swartberg, so it's where they kind of yeah, like lead to. Same with the parts of the Cedar Bird near Wolfberg Arch and the Crafts. No, I mean all of the surveys and science, a lot of it headed up by Alan Lee, who did a couple of the cycle surveys through the fynbos, show that their numbers are declining, but they are still there in the areas that you sort of like expect to see them, I guess. But the group size is an interesting one, because I know that even when I started at Blue Hill in 2015, we actually had groups. Like we were often studying territories that had 3 to 5 individuals. And then by 2017 or 18, we pretty much only ever had a pair in each territory, just because the reproductive seasons had been so poor leading up to there that there just weren't as many birds around. So I guess in a way it's kind of hit or miss, but with sort of continual drought, it's probably, I don't know. I imagine that they're still going to have boom and bust years, but yeah, they're still pretty spread out. You have to look and travel a pretty decent distance. Like you still have to go 1 or 2 kilometers, sort of between groups in a way, to see that many birds. So I'm not sure, maybe it didn't get across, but there's an extraordinary amount of hiking and traversing that went into seeing all of the birds that I saw.
And then sleeping up on mountains by the looks of things. But we've got 2 questions here. The first from Renee Clulo. You mentioned you used flap traps to catch the rock jumpers. Can you just explain how flap traps work and sort of the mechanism behind them? And then Peter Ginn's asking if you ever caught any ground woodpeckers in your flap traps.
That one I can answer first easily, which is sadly, no. I never caught a ground woodpecker. They would literally sit around the trap, but they did not care about worms at all. And I wasn't sure, curiosity-wise, I thought about trying to put a lot of ants in it, but that doesn't help because the mechanism, to answer the first question, is it's spring loaded. So it's the top is kind of like a mouse trap, as far as like it's a thing that you fold back and then you wedge a hairpin on a little flat piece of metal and you put the worm in the hairpin so that when the bird grabs it, the hairpin drops and this thing flings back and it shuts on them. So that, yeah, doing that with ants probably wasn't going to work. But yes, that's how they work. It's a literal hairpin trigger, but obviously it just covers the whole bird as opposed to stopping halfway like a different kind of trap would do.
Great. I think it's worth pointing out many people will be more familiar with mist nets. And I think you pointed out in your presentation, mist nets are great for kind of general bird surveys or catching a wide variety of species. But when you're really wanting to target in on one species and you don't want to unnecessarily stress out other birds in the environment, claptraps are a really nice select way to capture the birds. So yeah, it's certainly, I find it just quite a bit more fun because you set the trap and then you can hide and you watch, and it is actually quite entertaining to watch the birds kind of hopping around, and then the mechanism goes off and you've got your bird.
Yeah, it's much more maneuverable too. I mean, mist nets obviously take some work to set up and take down, so you're sort of stuck with where you put them, at least for an entire morning. Whereas by the end of catching rockjumpers, it would generally be me and a lookout, and I'd wander into rockjumper habitat with maybe 5 or 6 traps. And then if I heard one, I'd try to set them up sneakily in like a little semicircle in their direction it looked like they were going. But if I got it wrong, I could easily just grab them and move them to the next area. So it definitely allows for a lot more maneuverability for something that doesn't fly. So it's not going to fly into the mist net, and also just has such sporadic movements across a pretty large area.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm actually going to steal the next question from you, if that's okay, Krista. It's from Andrew Hall, and he wants to know why this bird was chosen as Bird of the Year. So apart from just the fact that Cape Rockjumpers are awesome, there's quite a process that goes into this. BirdLife South Africa has been running our Bird of the Year initiative since 2007. We started with the African penguin way back when, and then we've tried to alternate it and vary it as best as we can. And the way that we do this is by taking nominations from our members, the bird clubs and our supporters, and these nominations have to have justifications on why this would be a good selection. And we try to choose it based on quite a few different criteria. One of them is to keep it interesting. So we don't want 3 raptors in a row, as much as Melissa would love that. We like to kind of, sorry, I couldn't help have a dig there, Melissa. We like to vary it up. So we might have a seabird one year, and then we might have a small bird, and then we'll have a raptor, and then we'll have a grassland kind of representative. Another thing that we take into account is the different habitats. So we don't want to have too many birds of the same habitat or the same habits. We like to choose birds that have some kind of educational message. So for the Cape Rockjumper, it used to be least concern just 15 years ago. Now it's been uplisted to near threatened. And there's a number of different threats that have shown themselves and are growing. One of these is climate change. The Cape Rockjumper is the first South African bird to have its IUCN Red List conservation status uplisted for a climate effect. So as Krista has shown you, these birds are resident on mountain tops, what we call sky islands, because of this kind of altitudinal climate envelope that they inhabit. And as the climate warms, the birds have to move further up the slope to find cooler temperatures, and obviously they're going to run out of space in a matter of time. And there's a number of other associated effects as well, which we'll get into with the educational resources that we're going to be producing with Caitlin Judge. So Cape Rockjumper ticked a number of boxes. It's a striking bird. It makes for good merchandise, which is always one consideration, a minor one at that. It's an endemic bird. It's an endemic family along with the Drakensberg Rockjumpers. It's a fynbos endemic. Of course, fynbos is a huge part of our natural heritage and is the the smallest and the most biodiverse floral kingdom in the world. There are only 6 floral kingdoms, and the Cape Floral Kingdom is one of these. So for a number of reasons, Cape Rockjumper ticks all these different boxes. So that's why we went with it this year. All right, another question. Melissa, do you want to take one?
Yeah, sure. So we've got one from Eleanor, and Krista, we have a lot of avid photographers in our audience for these webinars, and Eleanor's asking what camera equipment you use to take your wonderful photos. We saw you swinging a gigantic lens towards Alan Lee as a button quail nearly hit him in the face. Would you mind telling us what you were shooting with, please?
Yeah, that was back before I actually upgraded. That was one of those like 150 to 500. It was but not like a Canon or Nikon. It was the Sigma. Yeah, it's like one of the off-brand 150 to 500s. But I started using one of the Canon 100 to 400s as sort of my default lens now when it comes to most things. I'm sort of crazy about f-stop. That's my big thing, is, you know, like being able to have a low f-stop helps with any of the sort of dim light photography, because of course the light is much harsher up in the mountains, and so you pretty much only have a very, like, the golden hour is even more golden in the mountains, because once it's midday, none of my photos from about after 8 o'clock in the morning are useful in any way, shape, or form when it comes right down to it. Yeah, so yeah, but also just getting closer. So the photos of the rockjumper next to the traps, that was at the cracks. So those birds are fairly habituated up in the Cedar Bird, so it's just much easier. And then the only other time is I actually had like a portable hide, and I scoped out one of their nests from like a different angle, and I think I sat still for about 3 hours, ruined my lower back, but I managed to get some good photos of those going to and from the nest. So I will say I don't have, for studying them for 5 years, I can on like one hand count how many good photography sessions I've had with rockjumpers. They are very difficult, even at the best of times with the best equipment, and patience is a huge thing.
Absolutely, and I think anyone who wants to learn that lesson will need to tune in next week.
Yeah, we're going to be talking next week about being patient with your birds, and your birding. So that's a good one to tune into, if that's something you struggle with. We have another question here, which is quite broad but quite fun. What was something that you learned from your research that you found quite surprising or unexpected, and that you found quite exciting? Was there anything that stood out for you?
Well, I mean, yes, though it is a little bit dark, I suppose. I actually wrote an article about it for BirdLife 2 years ago, I think, because this was after our 2017 reproductive season, which was very hot and very dry. And of our 19 nests that we found, only one was successful. And we ended up finding nearly constant boomslang predation of the nests, which kind of came out of nowhere, because even though we'd seen boomslang up in the mountains, I don't think we had any idea what a prevalent predator they were. So I ended up publishing on the predation, and the boomslang was responsible for more predation than everything else combined.
Wow.
So we are extremely curious now just to find out like how common they are in the fynbos, because obviously this is a pretty big predator for a mountain ground nesting species, and the rockjumpers aren't the only ones that are ground nesters up there. So everything that breeds up there must be vulnerable to boomslang predation. And personally, I think boomslang probably fall under the same category as a few other things, of things that the mountain fynbos, just people don't spend that much time up there. So a lot of it is observer bias of, if not a lot of people are up there looking for things, they're not going to see the things. So as much as some people think it seems weird that there'd be so many boomslang up there, like, why not? Have we been looking for them? Maybe they could easily have always been there and just, you know, in large numbers, and nobody's taken the time to actually sort of see. I mean, we know that at Blue Hill, there were at least 3 different individuals, which we can tell from sex and age. But yeah, that was probably the most surprising thing, and ended up just being a little bit soul crushing, because I mean, you find all these nests and you get so attached to them, and then you go back and the nest is empty and you have to scroll through the photos just looking through to see why, and it's always a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, nature can definitely be a cruel mistress when you start unpacking all of her threats. Letitia's asking if you could give us an indication of the breeding success of the rock jumpers, particularly after what you've been saying with the boomslang predation.
It varies massively between years. So there was a study done by the Fitz, I think between 1998 and 2000, I want to say. And they had in some years it was 70% success, and in other years it was 30. So it is quite variable. In our case, the one in 19 was obviously the worst. I think that ends up being about 5% success in that year, which is pretty terrible. But then the next year in 2018, we ended up having closer to, I think, 60%. But the only reason ours was also lower than the earlier study is they hadn't found any re-nesting. So they had found that territories only had 1 nest per breeding season, whereas we found multiple nest attempts. So I had 1 pair that I know I found every one of their nests through the breeding season, and they had 5 nest attempts, which was pretty huge. So, I mean, if you look at that, in their paper, that would have been 1 successful nest, but in mine, it was 1 of 5. So my numbers are also a little bit lower percentage-wise, I think, because of that.
And were all of those 5 sort of unsuccessful, or were there some successes within those 5?
The last one was successful.
Okay.
But yeah, their previous 4 were unsuccessful at various stages. Sometimes it would fail 5 days after they started, and sometimes 25 days after it started. So there was they're on the ground for 40 days, like their eggs for 20 days and then nestlings for 20 days, which is a very long time to be exposed on the ground, just hoping that nothing finds your nest. So yeah, that's probably part of the reason that they're not necessarily doing that well, is that's a really long time to try to make it.
Yeah, it's a tough life being a rock jumper. I know, having spent a few days on those Royals hillsides on a blustery southeasterly day, it's a rough environment to live in, and that's not even in the remote mountains of the Cedar Bird or Anysberg. It can get hellishly cold and also hellishly hot in the different seasons. So it's a tough life that they lead. So I'm not surprised to hear that their reproductive success is fairly varying, but also quite low. There's a question here from Ronnie Glass asking about their feeding habits. So obviously, you've shown us that mealworms are a favorite, but in a natural environment, what would they be eating?
Absolutely anything. They are not picky. We call them insectivorous because that's kind of the easiest blanket statement, but they will take small amphibians, they'll take arthropods, like they'll take beetles, they'll take grasshoppers, they'll take caterpillars or butterflies at any stage. I've seen them skimming little mites from dossy poop as just like a little like snack. Yeah, pretty much anything. They don't go after agamas from what I can see. But other than that, I mean, there's that very, it was famous in certain circles photo that Tertius took of a rock jumper taking a Cape dwarf chameleon. Like they will pretty much take anything that's protein. For things like grasshoppers, they will then often like smack it to try to get rid of the hard parts because those are fairly indigestible. But yeah, no, they are not picky.
Awesome. And what size area were you surveying with your sort of 19 nests that you were regularly visiting? How large an area was that?
Well, that was so that was at Blue Hill, which is 2,000 hectares, and it's pretty much all mountain fynbos. But I think we sort of had focused on 3 main areas of Blue Hill that probably ended up being maybe between 12 and 1,500 hectares. Like a couple key valleys or bowls that would sort of let us maximize, you know, we look at the one group and then just kind of travel around the bowl and over to another group and try to sort of see 3 or 4 territories in one day for different areas. So somewhere around the 12 to 1,500 hectares range.
Okay, and I think this is our last question for the evening. Neil Swart wants to know if you have an idea of the approximate lifespan of a rock jumper. Is there anything from maybe ringing records?
Well, this one is one of my favorites, but unfortunately it's one that we need to wait another few years until I think we have a better idea. At the moment, the oldest bird we know of was one that Alan ringed at Blue Hill as an adult male in 2013, which puts it at 1 in 2013, and it was last sighted in 2019. But right now, there actually isn't anyone there dedicated to looking for the rock jumpers. So I think in the next year or two, I mean, maybe some of you guys want to go look and try to find all the color ring birds, because that's really the only way we can tell is using something like color ring, because I doubt anybody is going to be recapturing the metal ringed birds anytime soon from the other ranges. So yeah, at the moment, I would say just it's likely that they live somewhere in the 15 to 20 year range, sort of like a robin chat as far as their life history would seem to suggest. But at the moment, I think 7 is the most that we actually know from a bird.
Fascinating. Krista, I think that's it from the questions. All that's left to say from my side before I hand back to Melissa to close us off is thank you so much. This has got 2021 off to the best possible start. I couldn't think of a better way to do it than featuring the wonderful bird of the year, the Cape Rockjumper, and I think you were the perfect person to introduce us to the species and kick off the year. So thank you very much. There's a whole lot of compliments and gratitude flowing through the chat box, so have a look at that. And there's even some ex-rodents who are saying it's all because you went to Rhodes that you produced these wonderful studies. I know my dad would agree with them there. But
we won't hold
yeah,
it against you, Krista.
Oh no, this is all going downhill. So before it all collapses on us, thank you so much from my side. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing plenty more papers and research coming out of this, and all the best.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for
and from my side as well, Krista, just a huge thank you for launching our 2021 Conservation Conversations. We did a poll while you were briefly offline, and just for anyone who's still interested in that, 45% of our audience have seen the Cape Rockjumper, which is absolutely brilliant. And I hope the other 55% will be heading off to Blue Hill to go check out your colouring birds and get you some of that information. But yeah, a massive thank you to you and to everyone who tuned in this evening. We had I think over 460 sign-ins, so wonderful to have so many of you back with us again for season 2 of Conservation Conversations. From me, good night, keep your eyes on the skies, keep enjoying those birds, and we will be back next week, Tuesday, same time, same place, 7 o'clock South African time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. A massive thank you to Krista and to all of you. We'll see you next week.